for the UK, the issue is that our productivity slowdown has been bigger than that experienced in other comparator countries. So we tend to look at the US, France, and Germany as core comparators, and our slowdown has been bigger.
Hello, and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Paul Johnson. I'm Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And today we're going to tackle the big question of how to grow the UK economy. That is really, I think, the fundamental policy question, certainly fundamental economic policy question, facing the country over the next decade. Keir Starmer has said it's his number one priority to get the economy growing, and he has said in the past, faster than any other G7 economy. And after years of slow growth and flatlining productivity, it's not surprising that a consensus has emerged that this is the priority for the next government. So, what do you do? What can government do to create growth? What policies should they be looking at? What role can the green transition play in growing the economy? There are so many questions. Very happily, to help us answer those questions today, we're joined by Anna Valero. She's Policy Fellow and Director of the Growth Programme at the Centre of Economic Performance at the LSE. Welcome, Anna.
Good morning, Paul.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. For those who don't know Anna, she is one of the country's leading experts on growth, on productivity, on industrial policy. So no one better to discuss this really tricky but really important topic with. Let's just clear the sort of undergrowth, as it were, just by sort of just being clear about what we mean by growth and why it matters. There are some people, particularly perhaps on the environmental end of politics, who would argue that growth is a bad thing. There are others who would say that we obsess about growth, particularly in GDP, and actually what matters is human welfare. So do they have a point? Is growth something we should really be aiming at? And what is it that we mean when we talk about economic growth?
Well, I'll start with what we mean when we talk about economic growth. This is basically the percentage change in GDP, or gross domestic product, which is a measure of the size of the economy. So you can think of this as the value of all the goods and services produced in a given year. And when we look at how that grows over time and adjust for inflation, we get GDP growth. And this is the measure that politicians often talk about. As researchers, we often think about normalizing that for population, also for hours worked. So we get to these other measures such as GDP per capita. So how much is produced per person in an economy, that gives you a measure of the size of the pie going to each person, basically, a measure of kind of living standards. What is that affected by? That's affected by the employment rate, so how many hours people are putting in, times the share of people being actually employed. And then labour productivity. So this is the output per hour worked. So researchers, such as those I work with and in lots of the work we do, we tend to think about productivity growth. And that's because that's ultimately the driver of growth in the long run. There's a limit to how much we can get more and more hours out of people. And of course, there are issues with inactivity in the labour market, but we actually have quite an high employment rate. So sustainably over time, if we want to improve growth, productivity is the way to do it. Now, of course, there are arguments then about, is this the right measure of our progress? And I think it's, of course, valid that the type of growth we're pursuing matters. It's not growth for any end. Of course, we can have growth that could destroy the economy, and we would see, we can have growth that can be damaging to the environment, and you would see recorded increases in growth, but a lot of those goods and services were perhaps polluting or creating negative impacts on society. And of course, we can have growth that is associated with high inequalities, and that's bad for society as well. So the way we tend to look at it is we need to be pursuing growth that is sustainable and inclusive. But GDP as a measure and looking at its growth does matter because it is a comparable measure. You can compare it across different countries. It does give you a size of, how much economic activity is going on. And it does tend to be correlated with lots of the other things that we care about. So if you have a growing economy, there is more money to spend on crucial public services, such as schools, such as hospitals, such as investing in the environment as well. So in the debate around green growth versus degrowth, I think it's better for us to be thinking about how can we make growth in line with the imperative to protect our planet and actually have a sustainable economy, now and in the future.
Absolutely. I mean, it's always struck me that, clearly growth gave us the welfare state. We couldn't afford a welfare state if we hadn't grown over the last 100 years. We can see that over the 2000s, before the financial crash, public spending on benefits, the health service and so on grew really fast because the economy was growing fast. And since 2010, the economy hasn't grown and there's been much less money to spend. I think it's also worth saying that we are producing and indeed consuming a lot less carbon than we were 30, 40 years ago, despite the economy being quite a bit bigger. So these things are certainly not necessarily in opposition to one another. And of course, the other thing that we've suffered as a result of the lack of growth over the last 15 years or so has been this intergenerational inequality where, because young people aren't earning anymore, asset prices have gone up. The lack of growth has actually driven this kind of problem about home ownership and asset accumulation and the fact that one generation is doing so much better than the other. So I think we'd all agree that things other than growth matter. But I think it's also pretty clear that without growth, you get the sort of stagnation we've seen, and that creates political as well as economic and social problems. So let's just assume that we persuaded the listeners that growth matters. We are not of the view it's the only thing that matters, but that it does matter. And certainly what you were saying, Anna, is that the most important thing that drives that is productivity. And indeed, people should, I think, look at, when politicians are talking about growth, you should really be looking at growth per person, because part of what's driven the growth in the economy in the UK over the last 15 years has been more people. And more people doesn't make us better off. You can just by arithmetic grow the economy by sticking more people into the economy. But what drives growth per person, as you say, is growth in productivity. That's how much each person produces. And this isn't about how, whether they're lazy or not. It's mostly to do with how well they're trained or what kind of equipment they have to work with and how well their companies are managed and all those sorts of things. The key thing about the UK, I think, in the last nearly 20 years now, is that productivity just hasn't grown or hasn't grown very much at all. We had maybe 60 years more productivity growing 2.5% a year. I think it's been about 0.5% a year for the last 20 years. Why? Why has it stalled? That is the underlying question about what's happened to growth. Why has productivity stalled so badly since the financial crisis?
Yes, well, as you say, so we've had less than 0.5% average annual growth in GVA, so gross value added per hour, since the financial crisis, whereas it was above 2% before. Of course, other advanced economies have also seen a slowdown. So part of this is discussed as an international productivity puzzle. There's a debate about, are innovations that we're having these days or that are coming to fruition, are they either slower to have an impact on productivity or perhaps less likely to have such a major impact on productivity compared to innovations in the past? So there's the kind of international debate. But for the UK, the issue is that our productivity slowdown has been bigger than that experienced in other comparator countries. So we tend to look at the US, France, and Germany as core comparators, and our slowdown has been bigger than those countries. So think about what's been going on in the UK specifically. I think it's fair to say there are a number of different factors, and different factors have had more or less explanatory power as we've gone on through this period since the financial crisis. Perhaps early on in the financial crisis, this was a story of credit crunch and constraints to firms being able to access finance to invest, and perhaps some labour hoarding, so keeping on workers, and therefore without the investment and more workers, the output per hour was going down. Plus then, of course, there was the demand shock. Then there's generally a consensus that austerity played some role. We had particularly deep phase of austerity following the financial crisis. We then entered into the uncertainty associated with the EU referendum, and obviously that led to lots of political uncertainty. So there was the high-level uncertainty about, are we leaving the EU? How are we leaving the EU? Coupled with an actual certainty of a worse outcome, which is increased trade barriers with our largest and closest trading partner. And then coupled also with broader political instability. Do we have an industrial strategy? Do we have a growth plan? Who is our business minister? Who's our PM? Who's our chancellor? So That uncertainty is bad for business investment because businesses need to know the environment that they're going to make an investment in, what their returns look like over time. And that's impacted by many policy choices, not just the tax rate, which your work at the IFS has highlighted. This has changed frequently, but also lots of other things when it comes to business policy. So we went through that. And then, of course, quite soon after that, we entered a pandemic and then an energy crisis. So there have also been these international shocks, which have led to also more uncertainty. So I think the fundamental thing that's going on here, and this actually, by the way, was an issue even before the financial crisis because we had a productivity gap in levels versus our core comparators. It's just we were closing that gap. The fundamental issue is one of underinvestment. We need to be investing in all those things you mentioned, which are the drivers of productivity, equipment, and that can be tangible capital, it can be ICT or software and other things, databases, innovation, so investments in things like organizational practices, intangible assets, and skills. So across all of those things, you can decompose a productivity slowdown. You can see that different things had an impact. What stands out for the UK actually is the slowdown in capital accumulation since the financial crisis and a lack of any positive contribution on human capital, which France and Germany did see. So TFP, a measure of innovation, that's been an issue for us and other countries. But the diagnosis from all of this is that what we really need is to see businesses investing more. And that needs policies for business investment, but also supportive public sector investment to help crowd that in.
Well, that's an all-encompassing diagnosis. I think it's very striking what you're saying is that so many things add together to create the context, the environment in which growth works. A stable and supportive government, the right education policy, the right levels of investment, trade policy, and how that's impacted by Brexit, what's going on internationally. I mean, all of these things determine growth and productivity growth. Let's take some of those one by one, as it were. What do we now know about the effect of Brexit? Which clearly that's the one big thing which has clearly been different about the UK relative, certainly to our European partners, but actually relative to most other countries in the world. We have withdrawn from a very close, very big free trade market. What do we now know? To what extent do we know about what impact that has actually had on our economy?
Well, the OBR's assumption is that this will be a hit of about 4% to productivity over time. And this is because of a reduced openness. If you look at our trade performance, goods trade has suffered, whereas services held up much better. The reality is that the UK is a really major exporter of services, and perhaps that's where, services are light. They can be exported all over the world. Goods, there's this theory of gravity where proximity matters. And so we've got a general decrease in openness when it comes to goods in particular. And this is an issue because if you think about what the UK is good at, it's very good at services, but also areas of high value manufacturing. And for that, with complex international supply chains, it's really important to remain connected into the EU market. I think one of the things that businesses say has happened, particularly in manufacturing, is these non-tariff barriers, things like regulations, they impose costs. One example is in the chemical industry, where we've had effectively a duplication of some of the regulations, so that increases the paperwork and complexity for businesses. So I think there's a strong case for re-examining our trading relationships. One of the things that was proposed in the Economy 2030 inquiry, which was an initiative that we collaborated on with Resolution Foundation, was that we need to be thinking over time of something more like a Northern Ireland Protocol for the UK in general, so closer to Europe when it comes to goods, but also really be focusing on services trade with new types of agreements, thinking about regulatory alignment, mutual recognition of qualifications, etc., and looking also further afield.
Am I right in thinking that one of the things that's really happened in terms of our trading relationships with Europe is that there's just a lot fewer firms trading because it's so, and particularly smaller firms, because the costs of trade have gone up. So as big firms have, they can afford the extra people to do the paperwork and so on. But there's been a really big fall in the number of smaller firms actually doing trade with Europe. Is that right?
Yes, that's my understanding. And I think even before Brexit was even on the agenda, there were lots of policy initiatives seeking to increase exporting amongst smaller firms, because, of course, exporting is a way of exposing yourself to competition, scaling up. It's associated with stronger productivity. And we know that smaller firms face barriers to that. So, of course, if you increase the barriers, that's particularly dangerous for those smaller firms that have less capacity to take on additional administrative burden.
Yeah, it's very strange. I did a program for Radio 4 about a year ago, and one of the things that we did was visit a small factory in the West Midlands who were doing sort of high quality manufacturing that you were talking about. And they said, they were quite a small firm, a turnover of 10 million a year or something. They said they'd had to hire an extra 3 people just to deal with the paperwork to carry on with the trade that they were previously doing. And that was a very kind of clear example of just additional cost associated, which hadn't done, as it were, anyone any good. So it's interesting. It is very striking. You say in the figures, services trade though seems to have held up. Now that was something I think economists were really just very uncertain about pre-Brexit. You can measure the costs of goods trade, whether it be through tariffs or the number of times it has to move to and fro the border. Do you think there are, are we now reasonably confident that that's going to be a long-term, it's okay on services, or are there still risks there because regulatory divergence and so on may gradually make that more difficult? Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, no, I do worry about those risks because fundamentally our finance sector and all the business services that are associated with it are a core source of strength for the UK and have relied on us being a destination for talent and activity. And a lot of that activity, of course, was in an era where we were part of Europe. So if we start diverging, that is a risk, both in terms of the success of the city and everything that flows from it, but also the actual trade data. I think that would be a risk. So I think it's important for us to embed that thinking in a growth strategy. Often when people talk about industrial policy or industrial strategy, they tend to immediately turn to manufacturing. But if you look at where our strengths are, and actually the types of goods or services that are growing over time, that is particularly services, and particularly the services that the UK has comparative advantage in.
Yeah, and just for listeners, it's important to be clear, services are what, 80%, 85% of the economy? They're it's the vast majority of the economy, isn't it?
10% is manufacturing. Of course, then there's other parts of production.
And so on. So services is the big majority of the economy. And I think that's always important for people to bear in mind. It's everything from haircuts to banks to big consultancy companies to pretty much everything which doesn't actually involve physically making something, which is what we're doing with our lives all of the time, including entertainment and shopping and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, the point to note here is, of course, not all services contribute to our growth because it's these high value add services that tend to be exported as well. And you just mentioned entertainment. Creative sectors are a big source of strength for the UK and exports as well.
Absolutely, and people often forget that. So you really focused in your introductory remarks on investment. And what's really striking in the figures is that our government investment in the UK is low by international standards, but not outstandingly low. But private sector investment really is outstandingly low in a way that we really don't want it to be. It has been for a long time. Do we know why?
Well, again, I think there are different explanations over different time periods. And actually, eagle-eyed people looking at the chart will see that our business investment rate started falling actually in the late 90s, early 2000s. And this was a time we were growing. So whatever was going on there is different to perhaps some of the explanations I gave since the financial crisis. But ultimately, there's all the stuff around perhaps harder to get finance since financial crisis, the uncertainty and other things. But perhaps there's these more endemic issues in the UK associated with short-termism in terms of financial markets and what shareholders demand from businesses, perhaps not putting pressure on management to be thinking about long-term value creation, which involves investment. and similarly short-termism, therefore, amongst the managers themselves. And that ties into the fact that we tend to have not terrible management practices on international rankings, but not best in class, certainly not as good as Germany or the US. And we know that management practices are strongly associated with improved productivity.
What about government policy and government stability here? I mean, this may not have been, the issues, as you say, will have changed over time, but whatever you think of the recent governments, they've not been desperately stable or predictable in terms of their policy, or as you said at the beginning, in terms of who's going to be Chancellor next week, and in particular, what an industrial strategy might look like. I mean, do we know that or whether sort of political churn and uncertainty actually costs us in terms of economic growth?
Yeah, so there is a literature in economics that develops these indices of uncertainty and has linked that to having a chilling effect on investment. And of course, you can plot that chart and you can see heightened uncertainty in the UK, particularly around the Truss mini budget. But I think there's this macro part, but there is also a much more micro part. So whether we have an industrial strategy shapes a set of policies within that. And some of those policies might be very micro. Things like help to grow management, help to grow digital. These are business support policies that are aimed at individual firms to try and improve productivity. Help to grow digital was one part of that. It lasted just a year. And we know that in general, some of these policies for business support find it hard to attract businesses to sign up, even when you can make a rational case that businesses who want to grow, not all businesses want to grow, but ones that do should benefit from some subsidized support. But of course, if this landscape is complex and changing all the time, that also doesn't help. But just getting to the meso level of the industrial strategy, we've had various iterations of industrial policy, industrial strategy, and whether we indeed have one over recent years. But fundamentally, we've had a number of different plans. Often they highlight or emphasize similar things. It's just the framework keeps changing. And that means that businesses don't necessarily understand what the context is that they should be operating in. So just to give you an example, actually in 2017, when Theresa May was the Prime Minister, Greg Clark, Business Secretary, and her launched this industrial strategy. It was meant to be for the long term. And I think it was quite an appealing approach because, first of all, they specified that this was a dynamic process, but it was a framework to be thought of as the long term. And also it combined some of the more horizontal issues that we face, such as skills, innovation, business environment, with some more targeted sectoral support and what was called grand challenges, which you can think of as missions towards clean growth, how to deal with an aging society, AI and data. So the types of things that's still very relevant now. But of course, this didn't last very long, lasted up until 2021. Accompanying that strategy was also an institution called the Industrial Strategy Council, which was independent but not fully operationally independent, was within the business department. So that was also disbanded in 2021.
Okay, so let's get on to this this tricky issue of industrial strategy, or industrial policy, which you hear talked about an awful lot. And I have to say, I remain hazy, really, about what it means. We'll get on to the specifics of that 2017 issue and the way this has gone all over the place. I mean, it's so striking what you say. It was launched for the long term in 2017 and then binned in 2021, and we all started again. And there's so much in government that you see where that's true. And we might even come on to the extent to whether other countries do these things better. But let's just start. Let's just go back a step and what do people mean when they talk about industrial strategy? What do you mean when you talk about industrial strategy? What might a good industrial strategy? What's it for? Because of course there are people who, sort of, as it were, who believe in the market, who would say, well, what is government doing having an industrial strategy? Companies know what to do. And there are others who would say, well, you need the sorts of industrial strategy you're talking about to give the support and the investment and the R&D and the skills and so on that companies need. And then there are yet others who say, yes, I understand that, but look at the 1970s and it was all about picking winners and that was a complete disaster. So what do we mean by industrial strategy? And what do we know about the good elements or the bad elements of an industrial strategy?
I think that's a really great question. And I think different people mean different things when they talk about industrial policy. And exactly as you say, some people think back to the 1970s and very interventionist state that ends up subsidizing declining sectors or firms. I think the reality is that the government gets involved in the economy in many ways, and industrial strategy is a way of putting some sort of coordination around that and thinking what's the actual objective here. And I think industrial strategy can be thought of as a collection of policies, industrial policies, but you could talk of, you could actually just say business policies, because I think even the word industry makes some people think of just manufacturing. But we're talking about industry, the private sector, businesses. And you can think of industrial policies or industrial strategies as policies that are somehow trying to change the structure of the economy in some way. So perhaps a general skills policy across the population, while that would certainly be a crucial part of any industrial growth strategy, you might not think of that specifically as an industrial policy, but even that is debatable. But let's say you're seeking as a government to change the structure of the economy in some way. Take skills. It could be you want to just upskill the economy. You want to have higher value-added work and sectors and support those high-skilled, high-value-add growth sectors of the future. So the kind of industrial policies that are discussed these days are often to do with the net zero transition you mentioned earlier. We know there's a global transition to net zero, an urgent one for us to address the dangers of climate change, and each country has a role. The UK's role is kind of outsized in a sense. We account for about 1% of global emissions, but we're actually a leader in a lot of relevant technologies. We have a very strong research system, research base, and there are a number of technologies that we really can leverage a bit more. So an industrial policy in that context would be, okay, so there is this innovation going on in universities and high growth firms, but how can we actually try and address some of the market failures through policies to try and ensure, or at least maximize the probability that some of those ideas can then be commercialized and grown here in the UK and contribute to growth? That would be what an industrial policy is. And in fact, we have those. We have many of those. There's always support for different sectors. We've got life sciences deals, advanced manufacturing plan that the Chancellor set out in the autumn statement that includes support for clean technologies. But as we've discussed, these tend to change over time, and there isn't still some holistic kind of overarching strategy to give businesses and people an understanding of where we're heading as an economy. And because of the differences in understanding of what we're talking about, I think that actually doesn't help.
And are other countries better at this? I mean, do you get more, if you're in Germany or France or the Netherlands, do you get a more sense of a stable aim from government that businesses find it easier to deal with?
I think what stands out for the UK is that there are lots of debates about what type of economy we are and what we want to be, which doesn't necessarily help. I think, I don't know, but other countries perhaps have less choppy and changing also because of their political systems, which mean that there isn't so much incentive to completely change approach, even within a party, let alone change of government. But the reality is that many other countries do have some sort of institution to try and provide some long-term thinking on these topics, often focused on productivity and growth, but often also with a kind of industrial policy element to them. So the UK stands out amongst a group of OECD economies as not having something like that. We had the Industrial Strategy Council, but it wasn't a fully statutory body. And also within the UK, I think, there are other areas of economic policy that have been more stable, that also have stronger institutions governing them, whereas growth and productivity within the UK stands out in that sense.
So, one of the things I think many of us kind of, and actually maybe particularly economists, struggle with when we're talking about this is partly some of the things that you were saying about the forms that some of the specific policies take, which is, it focuses on particular parts of the economy or particular places where we have advantages in green technology or what have you. So it's very easy for us sort of simple economists to understand that you need an appropriate competition regime, you need appropriate skills, you need appropriate investment incentives across the economy. The things that I suppose I sometimes struggle with is when you get to and we put in place something to support advanced manufacturing, or we put something in place to translate this kind of basic research to help this particular industry. How do you make those sorts of choices within an industrial strategy, and why do you need to?
Well, I think you need to make effective choices because otherwise choices are kind of made without the evidence or the framework to guide them. I mean, we do see government stepping in and supporting sectors or technologies quite often when they're seen as a strategic priority or there are security concerns, etc. And I think growth is a strategic priority and also links to security and resilience concerns, because without productivity growth, we don't see real wage growth and living standards. And that means we're quite vulnerable when these shocks and crises come along, as we've seen. So a lot of the work we've been doing has been trying to actually provide some of that evidence to guide decision making and think about the frameworks. And any choice like this in the presence of some uncertainty and also other countries doing similar, some mistakes are likely to be made. But the importance is that you have evaluation, you have frameworks guiding decision making so that you're not necessarily open to lobbying by specific sectors, and good data and analysis. So I think some of the things to be thinking about are there actual market failures at play, or is this activity best left to the market? And actually, there are many market failures at play, particularly when you're talking about innovation. The classic one, of course, is R&D externalities, whereby any innovator doesn't recoup all of the benefits from their innovation, and that justifies government support. And government does support innovation through things like R&D tax credits and things like R&D grants, and choices are made on things like R&D grants all the time. So yes, is there a market failure? There are many other market failures at play when it comes to net zero. It might be the need for government to help coordinate interlocking technologies and systems, because this is a system-wide change we're talking about. Take electric vehicles and the charging infrastructure, that's kind of a good example, or grid and renewable electricity generation. There are information asymmetries, heightened uncertainty, which then makes private investors less likely to provide finance for promising ideas. So there's a whole suite of market failures. And I think the idea is, and a lot of the work we're doing is to identify, okay, what are the areas where the UK can plausibly actually contribute to the frontier in a specific technology and plausibly have economic activity associated with it here? And then what are the market failures or barriers that government could meaningfully address, looking at the evidence of the types of policies that work as well, and hopefully evaluating any new policies.
So what's your conclusion? Just give us a few examples of areas where you think government could and should be involved in supporting or in supporting innovation or in supporting particular kinds of business.
Yeah, so I think at the high level, I think an industrial strategy should be thinking about our service sector strengths and concerned with the fact that perhaps we have seen some reduction in competitiveness, or at least we've seen productivity slowdowns in some of those sectors that we're particularly good at. Diane Coyle's work has shown that, actually, some areas of manufacturing and services. So that's the high level. But when it comes to specific sectors and technologies, I think particularly within green, there are things like carbon capture, usage and storage, tidal stream technologies, offshore wind. That's an area where we have a lot of innovative strength as well. Parts of nuclear. Actually, you can go quite deep into some of these categories and find promising strengths. So we have current work, which hopefully we'll be publishing soon, trying to shed light on that and really comparing the UK's activities in all the data that we can use to compare. So that tends to be innovation and trade, to actually understand, does the UK have strengths? Is this a growing area? Are we likely to be able to build on those strengths in the future?
And do you think the UK state has the capacity or the skills to intervene in ways that are you can be confident will be effective? Because one gets the sense that some of the infrastructure we have at the moment is a little bit underpowered, a little bit bureaucratic, not always as effective as it could be.
Yeah, so I think that there's a role for strengthening some of the national institutional infrastructure around this. So we've proposed a growth and productivity institution. Labour have said they would bring back the Industrial Strategy Council that the Conservatives had and strengthen it. I think there's a role for some national institution in this space, but also perhaps more activity at a devolved level as well. So We've got lots of mayors of combined authorities. They're developing growth plans. They have a local knowledge of strengths and barriers to investment. And I think we need to strengthen that level as well and improve the effectiveness of how national and subnational work together.
I wanted to ask about that as we come towards the end of this, which is, I mean, we've been talking about the UK as a whole, or possibly some have been talking about England, given the devolved roles of the other national governments. But we know that productivity across England is incredibly unequal. London is actually, on these measures, very, very productive. Other parts of England are really not, and that includes the cities like Birmingham and Manchester, which relative to similar city-sized cities in Europe are desperately unproductive. So how do you see a productivity strategy sort of relating to a sort of regional or levelling up strategy?
Yeah, so building on some of the discussion we've had on the sectors, services do provide a plausible route to growth in some of the UK's second cities. So if you look at, as you just mentioned, there are big gaps in the UK. The gap between Manchester and Birmingham and London is much bigger than the gap between Paris and Toulouse and Lyon. And Birmingham and Manchester have big populations. Services tend to agglomerate in cities. They have some underlying strengths in services. So a plausible route to reduce regional disparities would be to try and build up some of the UK's second cities. So to do that, you need to improve intra-city transport to improve the effectiveness of the local labour market. You need to be able to attract human capital, also build homegrown human capital, invest in housing, office space, all those things. So it requires a lot of investment. So there's the national investment needs. There's also the place matters in terms of where that investment happens. So services is a good route. I think also clean technologies and the areas of advanced manufacturing that we're talking about, they're also a good route to reducing regional disparities in the sense that actually a lot of those specializations and activities do take place outside of London and the southeast. If you look at green technologies, obviously there's a lot going on in Scotland. Lots of things happening in the West Midlands, in the north of England. Carbon capture, usage and storage is a technology that applies in former industrial heartlands often and is relevant for the offshore economy too. So I think it's thinking about these things that we can plausibly do as a nation and then thinking about where should they be located and then what are the barriers to that better location or more spread location of activity. In a way, if you address that, of course, there's always going to be some trade-off between pursuing a regional growth strategy and what would be best just looking at aggregate national growth. But the idea is to try and maximize the extent to which there's a synergy. So we have so many people living in these second cities outside of London. If we can raise the productivity of those workers, it will actually shift the dial on national productivity too.
Yeah, and they're the ones that were furthest behind what we know is possible because, actually London is, on international standards, a very productive city and lots of these places aren't. We probably need to start to bring this to a close. We've covered an enormous range of things. I guess I just wanted one last question, which is, we hear a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which has been partly pumping huge amounts of money into particular technologies, designed to onshore a lot of manufacturing, particularly in the green manufacturing. Is this the sort of thing that we look at and think we can't do anything on that scale? It's actually rather a good thing that they're going to put all the work into green technologies which we can then use, and it shouldn't really impact on our behaviour. Or is it something we need to look at and think, blimey, if we don't do anything to respond, then that's going to suck all the investment and skills out of here, and we really have to respond?
Well, I think the answer is somewhere in the middle. I think what America's doing is good for the world. It's good for America to be investing in clean technologies. We all benefit from the innovations that take place in America. But of course, America is a much bigger market. It faces less or different fiscal constraints to us at the moment. And I think they're also in a different position when it comes to international trade policy. I think for us, we need to be open. We need to have partnerships. People talk about friendshoring. We need to have partnerships on key technologies and supply chains. But there is a role for us to do much more than we're doing. I don't think we should just put our hands in the air and say, there's not much we can do because of the fact we actually have these underlying strengths in the innovation system and in our kind of industrial base and fundamental capabilities, some of which are kind of due to our geography. So I think we should be thinking about where targeted, smart investments and other policy levers can be used to try and leverage those. And if we don't, there is definitely a risk that we will, coupled with some of the other issues we have, we will become a less attractive destination for some of these key investments in the technologies of the future. This is a global transition. It would be a massive shame for us to not try and access some of the opportunities in that transition.
Well, perhaps that's not a bad place to end, because there's something sort of quite positive there about, and you've stressed this quite a number of times, that there are really big strengths in the UK economy, big parts of our service sector, some parts of our advanced manufacturing sector, some areas of our part of our sectors which need to deal with climate change, our strength in research. So there are real strengths in the UK economy, which is very easy to forget when we're being miserable day to day about what growth has been over a long period of time. But as you set out, growth has been miserable over a long period of time. And the reasons for that are really clearly multifaceted. I mean, there's the impact of the financial crisis, there's the impact of Brexit, there's the impact of underinvestment over a long period, there's the impact of political instability, which I think we often understate as economists, that actually politics matters for economics, almost irrespective of what politicians do if there's a lot of instability. And then there's so much to do to put the right things in place to support growth. I mean, the stability is obviously the first thing, our trading relationships at a high level, but then these really tricky questions about how we support the different parts of the economy. And I think the thing that's come through most from what you said, Anna, is we need to have stability about that. I mean, it's just ludicrous that we put an industrial strategy in place in 2017 for the long term, and then the same government tears it up and starts again. That's not how the economy works. And I think that's one of the things that probably frustrates those of us who comment on this kind of thing more than anything. And this really isn't just about this government. It really isn't just about industrial policy. It's about pretty much everything you can think of, that the lack of focus over long periods is a really damaging thing. I'm afraid we could have gone on for hours, but I'm afraid we really ought to relieve our listeners of this topic at this moment. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of the IFS Zooms In. Thank you so much to Dr. Anna Valero for sparing your time to talk to us about something I know you've been studying for a long time. To see more of our work, do visit www.ifs.org.uk. And to further support us, do consider becoming a member for as little as £10 a month. You can find out more in the episode description. We'll see you next time.